Very insightful, isn't it?
Mm.
Any thoughts, comments?
I like the thing saying that the Bible is not a children's story.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Yep. So let's do a bit of revision then. It's really important to see the bigger story, and that actually means knowing some facts. If you're going to read a Bible story in isolation, if we don't know the bigger facts, it makes a lot less sense. So these are some of the key historical facts that happened in the Bible. So it starts with creation, the beginning of Genesis, God creating the world and humans. And humans, of course, being in God's image, being valuable, and then turning on God. And dispersing throughout the earth. And then God takes one man and says, I'm going to make you whole again, people. And that's Abraham, of course. And that's the time of the patriarchs. Abraham moves from sort of the area of Iraq back to Israel about 1900 BC. And God gives him his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, and then the 12 sons. And that's the time of the patriarchs. They then move over to Egypt in the famine and become slaves there, where they're there for 400 years until God calls Moses to rescue the people. And now we're talking at about 1300 BC. That's the time of the Exodus, when the Israelites left Egypt through God's mighty intervention and moved into the land that God had promised Abraham, displacing the people who were there. And then we have the time of Judges, where God rises up leaders to lead the people primarily militarily, to keep them protected. Except the people, of course, look around at the nations and see that other nations have kings, and so no longer do they want God to be their king, and they call on Saul to become the king, and he's followed by David, and then Solomon. And that's in about 1200 BC or so. Solomon, of course, is born through...
No, that's not right. Saul was about 1050 BC.
Oh, well, this is...
So
this
what
is,
you really want is 1200 to 1050 is the time of the Judges, then have United Kingdom.
Well, it depends. There's various scholarly opinions.
There are two dates for the Exodus, but what I'm saying is the United Kingdom didn't start until Saul, and he was about 1050 BC.
But even that's disputed. The exact dates aren't known at this stage. We don't really know dates until we talk about the Northern Kingdom being exiled. So dates, important approximates. So they might be a bit wrong. They're approximates. So Solomon, of course, was the offspring of David through his adultery with Bathsheba. Well, I think they were married by that stage. And after that, the kingdom broke up into civil war, and Israel broke up into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah. And Judah was the one which sort of held on to God. Both kingdoms had their own kings. In the north kingdom of Israel, basically all the kings forgot about God. The people followed other gods, and that culminated in the Assyrian Empire coming in and taking over the country in 722 BC. And the people who lived there were marched off to foreign lands and have been lost in history. So they're gone, those tribes of Israel. No one knows what happened to them. Yeah, there are all sorts of crazy theories. I guess they mixed in and merged in with all the peoples of the Middle East, didn't they, in reality? Now, the Southern Kingdom maintained its independence through that time, and again it had good kings and bad kings. But eventually the Babylonians came in and invaded it and took it over. And they marched the people off to Babylon. And the people were in exile, away from their land. But through a series of events, came to the time when the Persian king took over and he sent them back, or allowed them to go back to Israel. And we're talking now, 500 BC or so. And they returned and they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple And then there is the end of the Old Testament. And then what happened next was 400 years where the Bible doesn't speak about anything. So we sort of know what happened in those 400 years. There's other historical documents about what happened, but the Bible has nothing to say for those 400 years. Then, probably about 4 BC, again, some people say 5, 6 BC, no one really knows, Jesus was born. God came to earth in the incarnation, God's Son, Jesus. He became a teacher and died on the cross, probably around 30 AD, and was resurrected. The Spirit came, the Holy Spirit came, and came onto the apostles, and they spoke to the crowds, and the church spread. And Paul particularly took the gospel to non-Jewish people. Peter did a little bit, and other people did a little bit, but Paul was the key one there. And that's the book of Acts now. And again, we're talking 30, 40, 50, 60 AD. And that's where the Bible ends, historically. So that story is happening in history throughout the Bible. And the books fit somewhere into there, and the stories fit somewhere in that. And what's key is that this history is told in a way that shows that God is in the picture there. God has a plan and a purpose through that. And in fact, I think I'll ask a question. What do you think the key theme or key themes of this bigger story are? What are some of the themes that you see in that story?
That God has a chosen people, or He splits it out.
Okay. So God is rescuing people, isn't He there?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Definitely. Other themes?
That even God's chosen people still can't get it right.
People get it wrong and rebel from God. Definitely. I think they're probably two of the biggest themes within there. So, these are sort of my interpretation of the big themes. That people rebel against God, or we sin, or we're exiled from His presence. There's slavery, there's death. All of those sort of fit into one of the themes, don't they? Then there's this idea of forgiveness, a return into God's presence, of life instead of death. And that's because of God's intervention. He rescues. He's the one who brings salvation because of His love. He's faithful. The people may not be, but God's faithful. So that's kind of the big key themes that are running through that whole story. So, I guess in sort of summarise this little section, when reading narrative, let's read it as narrative. It is a story with a message. It's not just a sequence of events. It's actually got a message, and we're meant to try and read the message. And so as we read it, we should try to understand that message and understand the theme, both of the individual story itself that we're reading, but also how does that story fit within the bigger message. So every story in the Bible, that's what we should be doing. What's the theme? What's God trying to teach me through that story, and how does that story fit into the bigger picture? So, let's do a detour. So, narrative, it's about 40-50% of the Bible. What books of the Bible are primarily narrative? Who can remember, or who can suggest a few? Genesis. Exodus. Chronicles. Samuel and Kings. 1 and 2 Samuel and Kings, yep. Joshua. And Judges, yep. The Gospels. Acts. Esther. Ruth. Fantastic. I think I forgot to put Esther in there. Ezra and Nehemiah, good. Yep. Then we've got almost all of them there. We probably do actually. So this is just my list I could think of when I was reading through. Genesis, the first half of Exodus. Numbers has a lot of story in it. Joshua, Nehemiah, Ruth. These are funny order. I don't know why I put Nehemiah up there. 1 and 2 Samuel. 1 and 2 Kings. It's 1 and 2, not 1 and 1 Kings. I've got Nehemiah in a better spot there. Good.
Maybe you meant to have Nehemiah's Judges.
I think you're right. I think that's meant to be
Judges.
judges.
Yeah.
Or
Thanks,
Jeremiah.
thanks for bailing me out. We got Chronicles, and then in the New Testament we got the Gospels and Acts. So these are the books that are primarily narrative, but there might be some narrative in the other books. Some of the prophets have some story in them as well. It's not quite black and white. So, when we've talked a little bit about it, when reading any of these books and any stories within it, the real key thing to understanding them then, other than just looking at the story, if you're going to understand the story well, you have to understand the context. And so, to do that, we've got to remember that narrative a story was written to a specific group of people in a specific time in history. So it is written to us today too, but the people writing it originally were writing to a specific people in a specific time in history. And so therefore, context is really important. What was happening at that time in history is really important if we're going to understand the story. So we should try to understand the story as it was meant to be understood. So this is actually a relatively new idea in theology. It's an old idea that sort of got forgotten about for generations. And then in the last couple hundred years, it's sort of been rediscovered. And it's called the grammatico-historical interpretation of the Bible. When reading a story in the Bible, we should be thinking about the grammar. Grammatico-historical. We should be thinking about the literary style it's written in, and the grammar, the words that are used, and the history, what was happening in history at the time. They're the two important aspects: historical and geographic context and literary context. So, let's talk about geographical, political, historical context. How does that stage help us interpret a narrative? Let's go through a working example. And I chose the one that we talked about last week. Pull open, if you've got your Bible, Genesis 1. Alright, now who wants to make a suggestion? When was Genesis 1 written and who was its original audience?
Oh, good question.
Again, this isn't known, this is just best guesses. It doesn't say at the beginning of Genesis 1 who wrote it.
Written by Moses?
Probably written by Moses, yep.
Yes, Moses.
So we're talking, 1200 BC. Who was the audience then?
Would have been the Jewish people, wouldn't it?
The Hebrews? Okay.
Who'd just been rescued from Egypt.
Who had just been rescued from slavery. Okay, so they were in Egypt, weren't they? They'd just come out of Egypt from slavery. Yeah, a few more questions then. Okay, so what was the world like back then? What were some of the prevailing religious beliefs of the whole area? And what were some of the beliefs about creation? Anyone want to make some suggestions?
Lots of idols.
Okay, lots and lots of religions. There's a polytheistic societies all around, wasn't it?
So,
Any other thoughts about what were some of the prevailing religious beliefs?
In Moses' time.
Yeah, not necessarily for the Hebrew people, but in the context they were living in Egypt and in the surrounding Near East.
gods were local.
Mythologies.
Gods were local with different powers. What was that one, sorry?
There's different mythologies.
Yeah, different stories about how things started. Do you know any of the stories?
Like the Enuma Elish.
Yes, the Enuma Elish is one which tells about creation, and it's all very chaotic creation. From you look at Greek myths, and creation happens as a god coughs or sneezes, and something happens.
It's an accident.
It's an accident.
That's familiar. There seems to be a creation.
It is, and so that's actually a really good connection for Genesis today, for people today. Was it an accident, or is there purpose? You said something, Luke?
I made a joke. It was
Oh, you made a joke. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So let's look at them then. Okay, so the world back then was a polytheistic world. There were lots and lots of gods. So these are the gods, some pictures of gods of Egypt.
Yeah.
Gods like Ra, the sun god. I think was it the moon god called Khonshu? I can't remember the name. Anyway, there were a bunch of gods, and the sun and the moon, for example, were gods.
Animals or something like that.
Creation, there were bountiful stories about creation. They were all chaotic, where things just kind of happened randomly. There was no purpose or rhyme to it, no reason to it. And humans were usually irrelevant, very unimportant, and nothing compared to the gods, without value. So, put all that together, the audience knows all of this. The ancient Hebrew people, as slaves in Egypt, they would have been surrounded by this. So you're looking at Genesis now. How is it speaking to its original audience? What are some of the themes that now become apparent in Genesis 1? In the
The
creation
structure,
account.
that there's order, because it was done in so many days, so
Right.
there's structure and order.
So we have a world that believes in a chaotic, random creation. Moses is saying in Genesis 1, no, there's order and purpose here. There's structure. Yep.
And that also what God was making was good.
Okay. So that's right. In a lot of the creation stories, there's a lot of bad and evil that comes out of the gods. We have a God that is making a good creation.
And he was also saying that you can't trust women.
That's Genesis 2 and 3. We're sticking to Genesis 1 at the moment.
That God was
You're
involved. God was in control.
Okay, so there was God in control. Do you want to expand a little bit on that in terms of polytheism?
But God,
No, it's speaking
How many gods in Genesis
one
1?
God in control.
That's
Right,
right,
it's
one
a
God.
single God, one God, there are no others. So these are the messages and themes that start to come out of Genesis 1, the narrative there.
And humanity was the pinnacle of creation.
Right, humanity is actually really important, really valuable. Every human and both men and women.
But also relationship too.
Okay, and there's a relationship in there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Again, that comes out more in Genesis 2, but it's there, isn't it? So there's a lot of themes you suddenly can see. Obviously, Moses, as he was writing this account, inspired by God, is giving us these themes, or the original audience, these themes for them to understand so they can make sense of the world in its proper light. Creation was by one God. There weren't other gods. It's not meaningless. It's not chaotic. There's purpose behind it, and people are valuable. All of these things come out when we start to,
And also that God is gentle and good.
it puts God as a good creator, doesn't it?
Good.
Definitely. Yeah, so even when you read it and you look at little things like it talks about God creating a lesser light and a greater light, to me that reads as that could be a direct response to that idea that the sun and the moon were gods. And again, we've got order, don't we, and purpose. We've got human value and authority as well. God actually grants humans authority in Genesis 1. So that's why the grammatical historical approach works well. It means we don't get led down the garden path too much. If we start thinking what was happening at the time, what people understand at the time, what was the original author trying to say to the audience then it helps us understand it for today. Okay, so that's historical, political, geographic context. So let's think about literary context. So when we read a story, as we looked at with the mouse and the lion, how we understand the story is informed by what happened just before the story, particularly in a bigger story, and what happened just after. When you tell a bunch of stories, they usually link in some way. You tell them in that order, and you skip bits in between, so that the linkage can be clear. And that's definitely the case in the Bible. Also, the words and the phrases that get chosen are often chosen for a reason, to help expand on the theme or the idea. So that's kind of the literary context. When people talk about literary context, that's what they mean. What happened just before the story, what happened just after the story, and what's the language choices that are being used. Yeah.
Is that why the Bible isn't in chronological order? So it links better with the themes, or no?
I think they link the Christian Bible tends to link, as in the Old Testament gets linked by genre.
Okay.
Yep. So that's how the Old Testament gets linked. You have all primarily the historical books first, and then you have the wisdom and poetry books, and then you have the prophets. And same in the New Testament. You've got the Gospels and Acts, and then you've got the letters, and then you've got Revelation.
Is there a different order for the Torah?
So the Torah is the first 5 books. They're always that order. I believe the Jewish people order the Old Testament differently. I can't remember, and they order it differently. Yeah.
Last in the Jewish.
So they might do it more chronologically,
Cool.
but I'm not 100% sure of the details.
All good.
So what is the reason that the Bible isn't, like, why did the scholar decide that we should order?
I don't know. I think as the canon was being confirmed in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, that just became the order that everyone read it in. I don't know why. Even some books got split up. So in the Old Testament, the Jewish Old Testament, Jewish Bible, I guess you can call it, Kings is one book, Chronicles is one book, Samuel is one book. We have it as two. I don't know why that is.
Same as verses, it was just a way of being able to reference and track.
Yeah, so that's right. So originally, of course, there's no verse chapters or numbers. They got added first. The chapters got added. I can't exactly remember when. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, so you could find bits easier. And then a few hundred years later, someone had the bright idea of then numbering up the verses.
But then they redid the interpretation, the language change, and it puts the verse positions of the verses out of order, so they don't fit.
Sometimes the verse is
fit
mid-sentence.
within a sentence.
Yeah, that's right. So it's
Interpretation of the.
I guess we try to make the Bible as understandable as possible.
That's what I want.
Yeah.
So if it's not in
Changing
chronological
language,
order,
Yep.
we've been talking about how the story, like
Translation,
a bigger
that's the
plot, and you see how you
Yep.
know the building the plot.
Yep.
So if it's not in chronological order, then that plot line it doesn't fit into
So
the plot
it
line.
is and it isn't in chronological
It's
order.
only because there is a lot that is lacking. Right? There's a lot that's happening at the same time, and so you can't have it exactly in chronological order. I did read it in chronological order, and then I suddenly found that I was reading the same stories,
Yeah.
sometimes 3 times, 4
Yeah.
times
Yeah.
in the Old Testament,
But
because of all the lapping.
they could do it in chronological order, but it'd be somewhat like a soap opera, where you have 10 parallel stories happening at the same time, and you get bits and pieces and you lose track of all of them.
Yeah. So it's quite.
even in literature, even in fiction, it's not always in chronological order. If you look at you know, the Chronicles of Narnia, there's different ways to read it, chronological order and published order, and that it actually works better if you read it in published order. Sorry if that's controversial, but that's the better way to read it. And something like The Lord of the Rings has books that just focus on one character, and then it jumps back in time and focuses on the other set of characters. And there's, when you're talking about something as complex as the story of the Bible, it's basically chronological. Chronology is too simplistic an organisational system to work with something as complex as the Bible, especially when you have parallel accounts with different purposes.
So you
and stuff
often
like that.
you often have chronology, obviously, within a particular section of the Bible. So Matthew is reasonably chronological, Mark is reasonably chronological, but they're separate authors, separate books. So it's complicated, I guess, is the easiest way to
When
understand
you're
it.
reading a normal book, it's the same. There's
It
no
jumps.
difference from
Yep.
when you're reading a normal book.
If you're reading a normal book that was written by multiple authors,
It's difficult, isn't it?
well, that's what I'm saying, it'd be like the Bible, you'd get the same story written at the same time, but you've got to put one in front of the other, or you end up with a soap opera.
Well, people seem to be able to handle it with the Marvel universe,
Yeah.
right? The Marvel Cinematic Universe that jumps all over the place.
Yeah.
And kids
So
are-
this is the biblical cinematic universe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Well,
Biblical
yeah.
literary
a
universe.
couple of people try to say that again.
So this is an example of, this is a worked example of reading the Bible in literary context, a story. So open up Luke 10:30 to 35. Someone want to just read that because it's quite short.
Stuck.
So this is a really simple example of how reading it in literary context is really important.
I'll read it. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, that he said, and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you have.
Cool. Thanks for doing that. So this is how Augustine interpreted it. If he was asked, what's that parable about? This is what he said. He said, the man was Adam. Jerusalem represented the heavenly city of peace from where Adam fell. Jericho was the moon, which signifies our mortality. Thieves are the devil and the demons. Stripping and beating the man means destroying, taking away his immortality by persuading him to sin. Leaving him half dead meant leaving him unable to know God. Priests and Levites represented the priesthood of the Old Testament, being unable to bring salvation. The Samaritan, though, represented Jesus himself. Binding his wounds meant stopping him from sinning. Oil represented hope. Wine represented exhorting the man to good works in the spirit. Putting him on a donkey was a belief in the incarnation of Christ. And the inn was representing the church, where travellers in this world return to their heavenly country, who will return to their heavenly country, get refreshed. And the following day represented, after the resurrection of Jesus, 2 pence is the promise of this life and the life to come, and the innkeeper was Paul the Apostle. So that is what Augustine taught that this parable was about. Now, this is a great church leader, wasn't he? Who taught amazing and wonderful things. But I think he got this one wrong. Because although he read it in the literary context, he didn't pay attention to the literary context. So let's pay attention to this in its literary context. Okay, what happened directly before that story? Anyone can remember?
No, I'm going to look it up.
Jesus told a man to love his neighbour as he loved himself.
Okay, a man came to Jesus and said, how do I get eternal life? Or something like that. Or how do I love my neighbour?
What must I do to inherit eternal life?
Yep.
In the law he replied, and you read it, love your neighbour, love your God with all your heart, with all your soul,
Yep.
with all your strength. And then
And so the man then says, well, how do I love my neighbour? And who is my neighbour?
Yeah.
And what happens directly after the story then?
Martha and Mary's story.
Yeah. So Jesus says, go and do likewise. And then he goes to Martha and Mary. And what does he say to Martha and Mary?
One got frustrated because that was the story of Martha.
Yeah, that's right.
love them.
Martha's busy working and Mary sits
Worship.
and listens to Jesus. And Jesus says, listening to me is the right thing to do. Right? So that's what's happening, isn't it?
Is that worship more important than...
How do I love my neighbour? It gets asked. Jesus tells the story, says, love like the Samaritan man did. And then he goes off to Mary and Martha and says, listen to me. What I say is really important. So how does that influence what we think that passage is about? Clearly it says, Jesus is saying it is really important to love people. Really, really important to love everyone. Not just those who seem to be our friends, but everyone. That is what's important, and that's how we get to know God. That's part of the key towards eternal life, isn't it? It's not complicated. We don't need to complicate the story by coming up with a whole lot of crazy ideas. We just need to read the literary context to get the picture and pay attention to it. So, I think with that in mind, we've got a couple more videos and that's virtually it, I think.